Downfall, an original Elder Scrolls story. Chapter 1. Trust. The city of Kvatch, the Black Raven Tavern. 23rd of Morning Star, 4E42. A sleazy-looking Khajiit was sitting at a table in a dimly lit tavern in the outskirts of Kvatch, close to the city walls. So, 500. That's as high as this one will go. Ha! The dark-haired and bearded Imperial across from him chuckled. Come on, Majara. You can do better than that. He laughed and shook his head. You know these scrolls are extremely rare. I almost died trying to obtain them. He stared at the Khajiit in front of him and tried to keep his nerves under control. He'd been in this situation several times now in the past few months since moving to Kvatch, selling whatever he'd found on his mercenary assignment to the local brokers. But this evening was different, as it was the evening that the past 2 months had all been building up to. It was the evening that he lived for, and pushed himself through many humiliations and strange situations for. This one thinks Marcius is delusional. The Khajiit shook his head and waggled its tail behind its chair. Scrolls like this are rare, but not as rare as Marcius tries to make this one believe. 500, or Majara walks. Fine, because it's you, Majara, but I hope you can live with the knowledge that you have robbed me here. He quickly flashed his eyes to the table behind the Khajiit. A dark-haired Imperial with short mouse-brown hair sat at a table, on top of which stood a simple wooden box with a padlock on it. The Imperial had a sleazy expression on his face as he was discussing something with the other men at his table. 2 Nords, a Breton and an Orc. The Imperial had a thick Nibonese accent and was dressed in fine, dark green robes. The man seemed to make a joke of sorts, the content of which could not be made out over the many sounds in the tavern, but the others at the table could be heard laughing at the joke, although some of their reactions did seem a bit forced. Majara knew Marcius would come back to his senses. The Khajiit smiled as the man he'd been dealing with handed him the scrolls, and the Khajiit, in turn, put 2 pouches of coins on the table. As always, this one has found business with Marcius very fruitful. Likewise, Majara. The man named Marcius smiled slightly. Although I'm currently looking for new employers, it seems that Tort has decided to move on to Chedenal, so there won't be any more assignments from him in the foreseeable future. Do you know anyone who needs a merc? Majara does not know. The Khajiit shook his head, but Majara will keep Marcius on his mind and will recommend him to any... Suddenly, the door to the tavern hall flew open as it was kicked in by someone, interrupting Majara. The man named Marcius put his left hand on one of his swords, but stayed silent. He thought, finally, they're here. I thought I'd have to stall him even longer. After the door had been kicked in, 8 people came walking in with their swords drawn, with 2 large men carrying rusty spears coming in after them, blocking the entrance to the tavern. All of them were dressed in leather armor, and they looked around as they stepped towards the middle of the tavern. The one in front, a Nordic woman with red hair and a simple iron sword, then pointed the sword at the table behind Majara. Hello, Roxantor. How about you hand over that box that you have there? The Imperial with the mouse-brown hair stood up, his men following his lead. What in oblivion is the meaning of this? You know what we're talking about, Vulgus. The woman stepped forward. You're outnumbered, so let's not defile this beautiful tavern with blood. Hand over the box, or pay for it with your life. You wish, the man named Rexantor said as he drew his sword, with the rest of the men at his table all following suit. Leave. Wrong answer, the Nordic woman said with an angry frown. Lads, let's relieve him of that box. A skirmish then ensued in the tavern, in which most of its occupants drew towards the walls as the vagabonds all fought out their quarrel in the center, knocking over the tables and stools in the process. Marcius remained calm, standing in front of Majara with his 2 short swords drawn, waiting for the moment to engage. Rexantor's men were being slaughtered one by one. Some of the invaders also died, but Rexantor's men were outnumbered and fell at a far quicker rate, until only he and an orc were still left standing, against 5 remaining invaders. Marcius then suddenly stepped forward and threw himself into the conflict, killing 2 of the 3 invaders in quick succession by stabbing them in the back, after which it was now 3 against 3. The plan had worked, as in the struggle, one of the invaders had managed to get a hold of the box, and with Marsh's engagement in the conflict, they quickly decided to flee, helped by the two spearmen still standing at the entrance. Before either Rexentor or the orc could do anything, the three invaders ran towards the entrance and fled with the spearmen. Rexentor and the orc were both breathing heavily in exhaustion, and the sleazy Imperial named Rexentor looked up at Marcius. "Fuck. I don't know who you are, but thank you." He stood up straight and then looked at the orc. "Grashmal, we need to get that box back, now." "Are you two wounded?" Marcius asked before the orc could respond. "You look like you're in no state to pursue." "We aren't," Rexentor shook his head, "but that box is of, let's say, vital importance. I need it back." "I can get it back for you. I'm going after them anyway. One of those guys robbed me a few days ago." Marcius lied about that, but nodded and gripped his swords. "Stay here. I'll pursue them. If you manage to get that box back, I'll promise to double whatever they stole from you, stranger," Rexentor said as Marcius ran off. The Imperial smiled. The plan had worked magically. He knew where the invaders, who were part of the local Trisprung gang, would flee and where he would be ambushing them. He ran through the nightly streets of Kvarch, passing many dark buildings as his boots clapped on the pavement. He took a different route than the one he knew the gang members would take. His would be quicker. When he arrived at the old, half-burned-down building in the abandoned eastern outskirts of the city, he quickly ran towards the alleyway opposite to it, where 5 Penitus Oculatus agents, dressed in simple leather, fur and iron armor, were waiting in the shadows. He nodded at them as he entered the alleyway, at which they drew their weapons. They all then crouched down and waited in silence. After about 30 seconds, they heard quick incoming footsteps coming down the street, moving towards the burned-down building. The 5 remaining Trisprung members slowed their pace, and they could overhear one of them say that they got away. Then they heard the voice of the Nordic woman as the gang members came closer. "Yeah, I don't know who in Oblivion that last guy was, but I don't think they are on our tail," she laughed. "I don't know who tipped off Lexus that fucking Rax Vulgus would be there with all these documents, but it sure worked out well for us." The 5 gang members then walked up to the burned building, and the agents could clearly see the Nordic woman carrying the box. "Alright lads, time to hide this thing here for the boss to pick up, and then drink ourselves to oblivion." The men were all laughing as they walked through the ruined doorway. When the last of them had entered, the agents in the alleyway suddenly sprung up and silently ran forward. When they reached the burned building, they saw the gang members all just loitering around, while the Nordic woman was standing in a corner, lifting a plank from the ruined floor. One of the agents used his free hand to give a simple hand sign, and then all 6 of them stormed in, taking the gang members by surprise. Each of them took on 1 gang member, with 1 agent to spare. None of the gang members had their weapons drawn. The spearmen had even put their spears against the wall as they had waited. The agents had taken them by complete surprise, and within seconds every gang member lay dead on the ground, some beheaded, others dismembered, some simply stabbed in the back or chest. The Imperial from the tavern then lifted the plank that the Nordic woman had stood over and fetched a small wooden box from a hidden compartment in the floor. He then looked at one of the agents. "Thanks for the help, Lennis." "Always, Julius," said the blonde Imperial with a large nose as he approached Julius and gave him a rough hug. "You really are ugly with that beard, you know, although I'm not sure whether you are uglier now than you were before." "Fuck you." Julius laughed and frowned. "It's strange to hear my name again, you know, after months of being Marcius." "I think you'll keep hearing that name quite a lot in the coming months," the blonde Imperial said, and then looked up at the moon. "But you should go now, lest you make yourself suspicious." "Yeah, you're right." Julius smiled slightly, sheathing both his swords. "Your plan worked like clockwork." "Of course it did. I was the one who made it." The man laughed and motioned at the door. "Good luck, agent. Do you remember the locations of the dead drops?" "Of course. Loose brick behind the 3rd bush on the western wall, beneath the broken barrel at Martin Street, and in the chicken coop of Tarsius Farm." "Good. Then you're ready." "It was good to see you again." The man smiled and pat Julius on the back. "Good luck, Marcius. You'll need it." "Good luck," all the other agents said in unison, nodding at Julius as he walked back. He then quickened his pace while the agents started working on the scene in order to make it look like as if all the gang members had been killed by 1 man, as they could not leave a single detail out of place. When Julius arrived back at the tavern, he saw it was almost empty by this point. After the gang members had left, most of the other patrons had fled the scene, with only the innkeeper, the man named Rexentor, and the orc Grushmal remaining. When Julius approached Rexentor, he handed him the box. I heard you lost this, sir. Wow, I'm impressed. Rexentor grinned sleazily. How did you manage to get it back so quickly? I know my way around a sword, Julius said calmly, resting his right hand on his sword. And they didn't, clearly. I called up to them in the east of town, and they did not seem to expect me, and I made quick work of them. I see. Rexentor nodded, looking at Grushmal with a satisfied grin. Well, color me impressed. He let his eyes run over Julius as he seemed to take the image of him in. Would you mind walking with us? I need some fresh air, and I suppose the guards will show up soon. He grinned, looking at the silent orc again. And now that we have this back, I don't think we have any reason to bother them with our presence. Now should we, Grushmal? I agree, the orc said curtly. Let's get out of here. Good idea, Julius said, following them out as the innkeeper bade them farewell. A bit too chippery. He's happy for someone who's just got his tavern destroyed, Julius commented dryly once they were several meters away from the tavern. He'd better be, Rexentor said in an annoyed tone. I compensated him quite well for his losses and for his silence of my involvement. He then looked at Julius, who was walking beside him. Talking about compensation, did you find your money back? No, sir, Julius said flatly. They seem to have already spent it, or so one of them said when I held my sword at his neck. A pity, Rexentor said in a clearly vain, sad tone. Well, then let me compensate you for your trouble. He snipped his finger, after which the orc, who was walking behind them, took a purse filled with coins from his pockets and handed it to Julius. 100 septims, does that compensate you properly? Ha, Julius laughed. That's far more than I lost, sir. You must be kidding. No, I'm not. Rexentor wagged his finger and shook his head. No, friend, the money is yours. He looked behind them at Grushmal, who was holding the box Julius had brought back under his left arm. That little box is quite dear to me, and definitely worth a measly 100 septims, so keep all of it, as a gesture of friendship, if you will. Thank you kindly then, sir. Julius nodded as he put away the pouch in his inside pocket with the money he'd gotten earlier from Majara. No, thank you, Rexentor said with a confident grin and pat him on the back. No, thank you, Rexentor said with a confident grin and pat him on the back. They were then silent for a while as they continued to walk down the dark street, but then Rexentor spoke up again. I just realized we have not even been introduced properly. He stopped walking and extended his hand to Julius. The name is Rexentor Valgus, merchant of, let's say, delicate wares. He then pointed behind them towards the orc. And that's Grushmal, my companion in business endeavors. So, you're a henchman, Julius thought as he shook Rexentor's hand. The name's Marcius Falks. I'm a mercenary by trade. So I've heard, Rexentor nodded as he motioned for them to continue walking. I had a chat with that old coot Majara after you were gone. Rexentor put his hands behind his back and raised a brow. He mentioned you are very discreet and are looking for work at the moment. Now if that's true, then it just so happens that I am a very well-paying employer who could definitely make use of someone of your particular talents. Sounds interesting, Julius said after a few seconds and then grinned, patting his chest, making the bags filled with coin chime. For the right price, I am always available. Ha! Rexentor laughed and turned to Julius, patting him enthusiastically on the chest. I know your type, and I like them very much. If you're willing to work for me and give me your discretion, there will be more where that came from. Idiot. You're falling right for the scheme, Julius thought as he grinned. I wonder what type of person you're talking about, good sir. Well, Rexentor said as he stopped walking and pointed at Julius' chest. The type who likes money and doesn't ask too many questions. He then continued walking, going into a dark alleyway. All right, Julius said with a chuckle. I'll bite. What do you need? Your services, Rexentor said simply and shrugged innocently, grinning at Julius. If you prove yourself useful, maybe even for an extended period of time. Well, My services are always available to those with the means to afford them. Julius nodded simply. So, color me interested. Very good. Rexenter smiled sleazily again. Then I'd ask you to follow me to my house, and we can talk of your assignment inside. Right now, sir? Yes? Rexenter nodded with a slight frown. Unfortunately, I've lost some of my personnel earlier this evening, and I have a quite pressing matter which needs to be solved at the earliest convenience tomorrow. While I happen to be a bit short on men at the moment, I could ask for assistance from one of my other associates, but I'd rather not bother them with this. All right, lead the way then, Julius said as he followed Roxantor towards a small mansion close to Castle Kavach. The mansion was old, but like almost all buildings in the city, had a lot of new stonework inserted into it, which did not always fit perfectly, as much of the repairs had been done with great haste after the Oblivion Crisis, now only 42 years ago. As they approached the mansion, Roxantor walked the steps up towards the front door and knocked 3 times, once softly, then forcefully, then softly again. He then opened the door with his key. He looked over at Julius as he unlocked the door. It's a sign for my guard, so they know it's me and not some burglar trying to get in during the middle of the night. Julius nodded as he followed Roxantor inside. The entrance hall of the small manor was richly decorated with silver chandeliers, extravagant red and blue carpets, and a few paintings of landscapes. On a chair at the far end of the hall, next to a set of stairs leading up, sat a bored-looking Argonian with a crossbow, reading a book. After the door had been opened, the Argonian had initially looked up, but when he saw who was entering, he had immediately focused on his book again. This way, please, Roxantor said as he led Julius and Grushmal down the entrance hall to the door at the far end, past the Argonian. Let's head into my office and we'll talk about business there. They walked through the door at the end of the hallway and stepped into a richly decorated office, with many bookshelves littering the walls and several paintings hanging between them. One painting, which hung directly above the door, was a portrait of Roxantor himself, where he was wearing a regal robe and a sleazy smile. It was a pure expression of the man's ego, and Julius wondered whether he should comment on it or not. However, as Roxantor walked into the office, Julius heard a soft female voice from the inside. You're late, Rex. Were you fucking around again or something? As he followed Roxantor into the office, Julius saw whom the voice had belonged to. A woman, maybe 10 years younger than himself, sat in the largest chair in the office behind the large regal desk. She had dark brown eyes and silver-white hair, which fell a few centimeters below her shoulders. Her face had soft features, with everything from her dark eyebrows to the red makeup on her lips being well kept. She rested her back against the right armrest and had her long, slender legs draped over the left armrest. She was effortlessly beautiful in her discourteous pose. The woman was wearing a black leather outfit, which fit her slim frame neatly, and had red accents on the chest and legs. Before they'd entered, she'd been playing with a sharp, curved dagger, which she put away on her belt as they'd entered. Ah, Layla, Roxantor said in an annoyed tone and walked up to the desk. What do you want? You know what I want, Rex, she said with a mischievous smile and stood up with effortless grace, walking around the desk, up to Roxantor and just held out her hand. Roxantor sighed and turned to Grushmal. The box. Hand it to her. The orc stepped forward and handed the box to the woman without saying a word. Thank you, Grushmal, she smiled, showing her white teeth in a quick flash before focusing her brown eyes suddenly on Julius, locking eyes with him and mischievously smiling. Rex, who's the new blood? She did not wait for an answer as she stepped closer to him, perhaps a bit too close for comfort, making his heart skip a beat. I could get used to seeing your face, new blood. She then put her hand on his cheek and stroked it a bit, stepping even closer until Julius could feel the heat of her breath on his face. He gave no sign of flinching and instead simply met her gaze. That's Marcius Fox. He helped us solve a little problem we had, and he'll be working for me from now on, if he performs satisfactorily on the task that I have in mind for him, that is. That's nice, she said slowly, as she seductively licked her lips and then slightly bit her lower lip, showing another flash of her white teeth. Julius, in the meantime, did not flinch and kept matching her gaze, not giving any reaction to her provocations. The woman kept looking at Julius as she raised her left brow. Are you not going to introduce me, Rex? Roxantor let out a deep sigh. Marcius, meet Layla Amnevelis, someone my Let's call him my boss, sends over to check up on me. He motioned at Layla, who was still standing provocatively close, and now put her right hand on Julius's chest, still locking eyes with him. Don't worry, she does that to everyone, Roxanter sighed. You've had your fun, Layla. Leave him alone. We have business to attend to. Ha! Layla stepped away from Julius and laughed, not breaking eye contact with him. You wish I did that to everyone, Rex. She then finally broke her gaze and turned to Rexantor. Unfortunately for you, I don't quite like men who have their father's hand 15 inches up their asshole. She chuckled when seeing Rexantor's embarrassed face. She then turned towards the door, walking past Julius, slapping him on the ass without looking back at him, only speaking up before leaving the room. We will talk soon, Rex. She then looked over at Julius and winked. Oh, don't be a stranger, new guy. She then closed the door behind her, leaving an awkward silence in the room. The silence was only broken when Rexantor now sat down in the big chair, motioning for Julius and Grushmul to sit down in some of the smaller chairs in the office. He looked at Julius with an awkward, apologetic smile. I am sorry for... well, that. He scratched his head. She can be a bit of a loose cannon sometimes, if you know what I mean. Don't worry, Julius said with a shrug. I'm not easily distracted. Ha! Very good. Very, very good, Rexantor laughed. Focus is exactly what I'll need from you. He looked over at Grushmil and then back at Julius. But let's forget about that little incident and rather focus on the matter at hand. Gladly, Julius nodded. Well, Rexantor said as he leaned back, I have some merchandise, which is currently being held by the authorities down in Fort Istris at the border with Valenwood. Merchandise. Nice name for slaves, Julius thought. Rexantor tapped on his desk with his index finger and nodded at Grushmul. Grushmul here will head for that fort tomorrow and make sure the merchandise is released and will be able to reach its destination. He smiled and then looked at Julius. What I need you to do, dear Marcius, is simply take care of some vagabonds camped out on the road to Fort Istris who would like to prevent my merchandise from reaching its destination. All right, taking care of them seems simple enough. What's the catch? Nothing, Rexantor said with a smile, folding his hands. Take care of those vagabonds along the road. Perhaps look around a bit on your way back to see if there are more of them camped out along the road, and then get back to me. When Grushmil reports the merchandise to be delivered, I will pay you handsomely. Julius nodded slowly. And what if Grushmil fucks up on his way here? What about a reward for my efforts then? I won't, Grushmil said simply. He won't, Rexantor echoed calmly, motioning towards Grushmil with his folded hands. He then unfolded his hands and offered Julius his right hand. Are we agreed? We are, Julius nodded with a frown. Wonderful! Rexantor smiled again as he pat his hand as he shook it. And I assure you, if you complete this job successfully and discreetly, I'll be happy to employ you for the long term. He winked. And the pay will be right up your standard, I can assure you that. That sounds great, sir. They talked over the details of his job then, with Grushmil giving him the exact locations where he presumed the ambushes would be waiting, and giving him the time when he thought he'd be leaving the fort. When they were done talking about the details, Julius stood up. Well, I'd best get home then and have a good rest. I would not want to be late on my first day on the job. Very, very right, Rexantor smiled. Report to me here when you have flushed out those vagabonds. I will, sir. Julius then left the mansion, the Argonian guard in the entrance hall not paying him any mind. And as he walked on the streets, he thought, I'm in. Chapter 2. Welcome to the family. Julius used a piece of cloth he'd cut from a tunic of one of the men he'd just put down to clean his sword of their blood. He spat on the ground as he looked at the still face of one of them. They had been laying in an ambush several miles from Fort Istris, hiding in a light forest. Fortunately, Julius had learned several detection spells during his training as a Penitus Oculatus agent, which had made it easy to sneak up on the men. All of them had been common bandits, hiding in the bushes and among the trees. Perhaps they had been hired by the Trisprung or any other rival gang. He personally suspected that it was likely that it had been the Trisprung gang which had hired the goons, as they were the bitter rival of the Vulgus family in the field of slavery, human traffic and prostitution. Any other gang, like the Serpents or the Romarodon, would be unlikely. as they tended to keep themselves mostly to extortion and intimidation within Kvatch. Julius frowned slightly as he examined the bodies for any possible orders or something which would give away their allegiance. He had no doubt that Roxantor already knew who the bandits had been sent by, but it was unlikely that he'd immediately trust him enough to tell Julius straight away, so he had to do his own investigations. The agent took in all the details, examining the bodies closely, even removing some of the clothes partially to see if he could find any gang tattoos. As part of the preparation for this mission, he'd had to study every piece of information the Penetus Oculatus archives had on the gangs in the city of Kvatch. It had taken him weeks of study within the archives, as Kvatch was by far the most corrupt and gang-ridden place in the entire empire. It was kind of an open secret at this point that if you had money and wanted to get your hands on something illegal, Kvatch was the place to go. For years now, Emperor Titus Mede had attempted to crack down on corruption and crime within the city, as the severity of it had led to the destabilization of the entire Gold Coast region for years now. It had all started only a few months after the end of the Oblivion Crisis, when an influential member of Kvatch's merchant aristocracy named Cynices Valgus had seized power following the death of the previous count, Ormelius Goldwine, during the invasion from Oblivion. The new count had used the chaos of a city being rebuilt to significantly fill his own pockets and enrich his friends within the aristocracy, thus neglecting proper management of the town's revival. It was only when Titus Mede had seized the imperial throne 17 years after the Oblivion Crisis that Count Valgus was ousted from his position by the emperor and replaced by Regulus Mede, the emperor's cousin. Count Regulus, however, had very limited success in trying to get County Kvatch's affairs back in order over the past 25 years. The system of corruption and cronyism left by the previous count had worked against him at every turn, with many of the local government's officials being suspected of being compromised. The system in the city was rigid, and it was there to stay, as it was being kept in place by forces beyond the shadows of Kvatch's streets. Cynices Valgus had been able to keep his hold on the system after being released from Kvatch's dungeons by the local commander of the guard, without any fines or losses to his property. Before Regulus Mede had even set a foot within the city walls, Cynices Valgus had stepped out of the dungeon as a free man. Since the moment of his ousting as count, Valgus had built himself a comfortable position of power and influence. Nothing in the city happened without him knowing of it, with many souls within the city bound to him by the dirt he'd obtained on them during his time as count, or after, making sure that he was always well informed. In the imperial city, most people often refer to Kvatch as a swamp, and to Cynices Valgus as the dangerous swamp monster lurking beneath the water, observing everything and striking out against anything it didn't like to have within its territory. 5 times Count Regulus Mede had attempted to get rid of Cynices, and 5 times he'd failed. Whenever an operation against Cynices took place, the Count had found himself either betrayed by his own men, suddenly drained of resources, or being inconvenienced beyond belief by other means. The Emperor had even stepped in the year before last, as he'd sent Penetus Oculatus assassins to deal with Cynices once and for all. But the attempt on his life had failed. The agents had been found dead, and that very night an assassin had found his way into Count Regulus's bedroom and had cut off his right foot as a warning. No more open attempts to thwart Cynices had been made since then, as Count Regulus had been too fearful to allow any more operations within the city walls. The Emperor, however, had been outraged and had ordered the Penetus Oculatus to work on a plan to get rid of Cynices and the underworld of Kvatch one way or the other. Months of investigation had taken place, which had revealed that Cynices had built an entire syndicate, which was like a web of confidence and purchased souls around him. He uses his own family to run the syndicate, with his sons, adopted daughter and brother occupying the most influential positions within his dealings. The agents involved in building the case had judged that in order to truly begin changing the culture of Kvatch, they would all need to be dealt with. If Cynices were somehow assassinated, one of his relatives involved within his dealings would simply take over. But at the same time, if the Penetus Oculatus started to simply assassinate everyone in the family one by one, there was no doubt that someone in the family would catch on and retaliate. No, this operation would have to be executed with the utmost precision and care. An infiltration would need to take place, and an agent would need to find ways to deal with the members of the Valgus family in ways where their connections would not be able to help them, and nobody would catch on to the intention. Julius, being one of the Penetus Oculatus' first and most trusted members, had been chosen for the infiltration. The build-up to the operation had taken months, with the final period before the start of the operation having him settle into Kvarts as a mercenary, in order for him not to stand out as a new arrival, as they would make contact with the Valga syndicate. During those months, Julius had needed to own his role in disguise, letting on nothing about his intentions, completing mercenary contracts whenever he could get them, trying to get a bit of a reputation within the city. At first, he'd been working for a wandering merchant who had arrived in the city a few days before he had. That merchant had been an agent, placed there for the operation, but after the undercover merchant had left, Julius hadn't seen any fellow agent for months. All that remained, which reminded him of his real life, were the occasional dead drops he had to leave or pick up, which were all few and far between, as they needed to keep risk to an absolute minimum. The dead drops had always been marked with one of 40 specific passwords, none of which could be reused, and all of which he'd have to study and get into his head before the start of his assignment. The passwords were not written down and were only known to him, his intendant, and the head of the operation in order to counter possible hijack dead drops. The past few months had been tough, but it had all been worth it, as they had been able to successfully make contact with a member of the Valgus family, Raxantor, the middle child of Genesis Valgus. He was the one concerning himself with prostitution, slavery, and human traffic, and perhaps most importantly, Raxantor tended to be clumsy, often wanting to appear better than he actually was. It was the entire reason the operation had succeeded, as instead of asking his father or his older brother Fanero, who organized most of the family's goons, for more men, he had tried to cover his own losses with a conveniently placed mercenary. Exactly as the Penitus Oculatus intended.